I think I am so tired that I read the book without going live. So we're talking about happiness. Let's see where we left off. I think maybe 42, number 42. Yeah, so we read through number 42. Number 43, it's really just a couple pages. I mean, I read them. We talked about poignant sauces. We talked about uneasiness. We talked about the infinite degree of happiness which is not in our possession. All uneasiness, therefore, being removed, a moderate portion of good seems at present to content men, and some few degrees of pleasure in a succession of ordinary enjoyments make up a happiness wherein they can be satisfied. If this were not so, there could be no room for those indifferent and visible trifling actions to which our wills are so often determined, and wherein we voluntarily waste so much of our lives, which remissness could by no means consist with a constant determination of will or desire to the greatest apparent good. That this is so, I think few people need to go far from home to be convinced, and indeed, in this life there are not many whose happiness reaches so far as to afford them a constant train of moderate mean pleasures, without any mixture of uneasiness, and yet they could be content to stay here forever, though they cannot deny but that it is possible there may be a state of eternal, durable joys after this life, far surpassing all the good that is found here. Nay, they cannot but see that it is more possible than the attainment and continuation of that pittance of honor, riches, or pleasure which they pursue, and for which they neglect that eternal state, but yet in full view of this difference, satisfied of the possibility of a perfect, secure, and lasting happiness in a future state, and under a clear conviction that it is not to be had here, whilst they bound their happiness within some little enjoyment or aim of this life, and exclude the joys of heaven from making any necessary part of it, their desires are not moved by this greater apparent good, nor their wills determined to any action or endeavor for its attainment. So apparently we have 0 viewers and 2 likes. That's a pretty good ratio of what's going on here. I'm starting to doubt that the stream is up because I started reading without streaming. So now I want to kind of check that we are actually streaming. Let's mess about here. Everything's proceeding according to plan. Okay. If I search Locke, do I come up? What if I search Locke ASMR? Do I pop up? Well, some of this... Oh, here we go. Now we can check. Okay. It looks like it's working. Good evening. I was so confused. People literally are seeing the video, liking it, and leaving. That's how effective my propaganda is. Let's take a swig of plastic. I was gifted a gift. Gift in German means poison. Someone gave me a plastic water bottle, and I don't want to waste the water, so I'm poisoning myself. I am not a perfect man. We're gonna read the rest of this. Possibility of perfect, secure, determined. Okay, so people don't care about heaven, apparently. The ordinary necessities of our lives fill a greater part of them with the uneasiness of hunger, thirst, heat, cold, weariness, with labor and sleepiness, in their constant returns, etc., to which, if besides accidental harms, We add the fantastical uneasiness as itch after honor, power, or riches, etc., which acquired habits by fashion, example, and education have settled in us, and 1,000 other irregular desires which caution has made natural to us. We shall find that a very little part of our life is so vacant from these uneasinesses as to leave us free to the attraction of remoter absent good. We are seldom at ease and free enough from the solicitation of our natural or adopted desires, but to a constant succession of uneasiness out of that stock which natural wants or acquired habits have heaped up, take the will in their turns, and no sooner is one action dispatched, which by such a determination of the will we are set upon, but another uneasiness is ready to set us on work, for the removing of the pains we feel and are at present pressed with, being the getting out of misery, and consequently the first thing to be done in order to happiness absent good, though thought on, confessed, and appearing to be good, not making any part of this unhappiness in its absence, is jostled out to make way for the removal of those uneasinesses we feel, till due and repeated contemplation has brought it near to our mind, given some relish of it, and raised in us some desire, which then beginning to make a part of our present uneasiness, stands upon fair terms with the rest to be satisfied, and so according to its greatness and pressure comes in its turn to determine the will. And thus by a due consideration and examining any good proposed, it is in our power to raise our desires in a due proportion to the value of that good, whereby in its turn the place it may come to work upon the will and be pursued. I think that's pursued. Persired? I'm not sure. For good, though appearing and allowed never so great, yet till it has raised desire in our minds, and thereby made us uneasy in its wants, it reaches not our wills. We are not within the sphere of its activity, our wills being under the determination only of those uneasinesses which are present to us, which, whilst we have any, are always soliciting and ready at hand to give the will its next determination. The balancing, when there is any in the mind, being only which desire shall be next satisfied, which uneasiness first removed, whereby it comes to pass that as long as any uneasiness, any desire remains in our mind, there is no room for good, barely as such to come at the will, or at all to determine it, because, as has been said, the first step in our endeavors after happiness being to get wholly out of the confines of misery, and to feel no part of it, the will can be at leisure for nothing else, till every uneasiness we feel be perfectly removed, which in the multitude of wants and desires we are beset with in this imperfect state, we are not like to be ever freed from in this world. There being in us a great many uneasinesses, always soliciting and ready to determine the will, it is natural, as I have said, that the greatest and most pressing should determine the will to the next action, and so it does for the most part, but not always. The power to suspend the prosecution of any desire makes way for consideration. For the mind having, in most cases, as is evident in experience, the power to suspend the execution and satisfaction of any of its desires, and so all, one after another, is at liberty to consider the objects of them, examine them on all sides, and weigh them with others. In this lies the liberty man has, and from the not using it right comes all that variety of mistakes, errors, and faults, which we run into in the conduct of our lives and our endeavors after happiness, whilst we precipitate the determination of our wills and engage too soon before due examination. To prevent this, we have a power to suspend the prosecution of this or that desire, and everyone daily may experiment in himself. This seems to me the source of all liberty, and this seems to consist that which is, as I think, improperly called free will. For during this suspension of any desire before the will be determined to action, and the action which follows that determination done, we have opportunity to examine, view, and judge of the good or evil of what we are going to do, and when upon due examination we have judged, we have done our duty, all that we can or ought to do in pursuit of our happiness, and 'tis not a fault, but a perfection of our nature to desire, will, and act according to the last result of a fair examination. This is so far from being a restraint or diminution of freedom that it is the very improvement and benefit of it. 'Tis not an abridgment, 'tis the end and use of our liberty, and the farther we are removed from such a determination, the nearer we are to misery and slavery. Perfect indifference in the mind, not determinable by its last judgment of the good or evil that is thought to attend its choice, would be so far from being an advantage and excellency of an intellectual nature that it would be as great an imperfection as the want of indifferency to act or not to act, till determined by the will, would be an imperfection on the other side. A man is at liberty to lift up his hand to his head or let it rest quiet. He is perfectly indifferent in either, and it would be an imperfection in him if he wanted that power, if he were deprived of that indifferency. But it would be as great an imperfection if he had the same indifferency, whether he would prefer the lifting up his hands or its remaining in rest when he would save his head or eyes from a blow he sees coming. 'Tis as much a perfection that desire or the power of preferring should be determined by good, as that the power of acting should be determined by the will, and the certainter such determination is, the greater is the perfection. Nay, we are determined by anything but the last result of our own minds, judging of the good or evil of any action we were not free. The very end of our freedom being that we might attain the good we choose, and therefore every man is put under a necessity by his constitution as an intelligent being to be determined in willing by his own thought and judgment what is best for him to do, else he would be under the determination of some other than himself, which is want of liberty. And to deny that a man's will in every determination follows his own judgment is to say that a man wills and acts for an end that he would not have at the time that he wills and acts for it. For if he prefers in his present thoughts before any other, 'tis plain he then thinks better of it, and would have it before any other, unless he can have or not have it, will and not will it at the same time, a contradiction too manifest to be admitted. The free agents are so determined. If we look upon those superior beings above us who enjoy perfect happiness, we shall have reason to judge that they are more steadily determined in their choice of good than we, and yet have no reason to think they are less happy or less free than we are. And if it were fit for such poor finite creatures as we are to pronounce what infinite wisdom and goodness could do, I think we might say that God himself cannot choose what is not good. The freedom of the Almighty hinders not his being determined by what is best. God cannot choose what is not good. Okay, we're getting into like some Epicurean nominalist territory here. Questioning, can God do evil? Is he restricted by what is good and evil? A constant determination to a pursuit of happiness, no abridgment of liberty. But to give a right view of this mistaken part of liberty, let me ask, would anyone be a changeling because he is less determined by wise considerations than a wise man? It is worth the name of freedom to be at liberty to play the fool and draw some shame and misery upon a man's self, if to break loose from the conduct of reason and to want that restraint of examination and judgment which keeps us from choosing or doing the worst or the worse, be liberty true liberty, madmen and fools are the only free men. But yet I think nobody would choose to be mad for the sake of such liberty, but he that is mad already. The constant desire of happiness and the constraint it puts upon us to act for it, nobody, I think, accounts an abridgment of liberty, or at least an abridgment of liberty to be complained of. God Almighty himself is under the necessity of being happy, and the more any intelligent being is so, the nearer is its approach to infinite perfection and happiness. That, in this state of ignorance, we short-sighted creatures might not mistake true felicity, we are endowed with power to suspend any particular desire and keep it from determining the will and engaging us in action. This is standing still, where we are not sufficiently assured of the way. Examination is consulting a guide. The determination of the will upon enquiry is following the direction of that guide. And he that has a power to act or not to act according as such determination directs is a free agent. Such determination abridges not that power wherein liberty consists. So this is interesting. I've talked before about how life is slavery or God is slavery or something. And he's talking about how madmen would be the only men who are truly free according to a certain definition, which is a very interesting statement. But he rejects that. He says that no, it is the power of consulting a guide, the suspension of the will, that makes us free. That is wherein liberty consists. He that has his chains knocked off and the prison doors set open to him is perfectly at liberty, because he may either go or stay as he best likes, though his preference be determined to stay by the darkness of the night, or illness of the weather, or want of other lodging. He ceases not to be free, though the desire of some convenience to be had there absolutely determines his preference and makes him stay in his prison. And therefore the highest perfection of an intellectual nature lies in a careful and constant pursuit of true and solid happiness. So the care of ourselves that we mistake not imaginary for real happiness is the necessary foundation of our liberty. The pursuit of happiness. I think the founding fathers were reading this. The stronger ties we have to an unalterable pursuit of happiness in general, which is our greatest good and which is such our desires always follow, the more are we free from any necessary determination of our will to any particular action, and from a necessary compliance with our desire, set upon any particular and then appearing preferable good, till we have duly examined whether it has a tendency to or be inconsistent with our real happiness. And therefore, till we are as much informed upon this enquiry as the weight of the matter and the nature of the case demands, we are by the necessity of preferring and pursuing true happiness as our greatest good obliged to suspend the satisfaction of our desire in particular cases. This is the hinge on which turns the reason of liberty of intellectual beings in their constant it. I don't know why there's like some big white space here. Oh, I see. This is the hinge on which turns the liberty of intellectual beings in their constant endeavors after, and a steady prosecution of true felicity, that they can suspend this prosecution in particular cases till they have looked before them and informed themselves whether that particular thing which is then proposed or desired lie in their way to their main end, and make a real part of that which is their greatest good. For the inclination and tendency of their nature to happiness is an obligation and motive to them to take care not to mistake or miss it, and so necessarily puts them upon caution, deliberation, and wariness in the direction of their particular actions, which are the means to obtain it. So kind of interesting to think of a guy like Ernst Jünger and his concept of the anarch, and that to be free there must be a rule against which he rebels or participates in, or what exactly that means. I wonder what Jünger thought of Locke. Whatever necessity determines to the pursuit of real bliss, the same necessity with the same force establishes suspense, deliberation, and scrutiny of each successive desire, whether the satisfaction of it does not interfere with our true happiness and mislead us from it. Another thinker would be Adam Katz and his concept of deferral as being the locus or center of leadership, which I disagree with, but it seems that deferral and suspension are very similar concepts. This, it seems to me, is the great privilege of finite intellectual beings, and I desire it may be well considered whether the great inlet and exercise of all the liberty men have are capable of or can be useful to them, and that whereon depends the turn of their actions does not lie in this, that they can suspend their desires and stop them from determining their wills to any action till they have duly and fairly examined the good and evil of it, as far forth as the weight of the thing requires. This we are able to do, and when we have done it, we have done our duty and all that it is in our power, and indeed all that needs. For since the will supposes knowledge to guide its choice, all that we can do is to hold our wills undetermined till we have examined the good and evil of what we desire. What follows after that follows in a chain of consequences linked one to another, all depending on the last determination of the judgment, which whether it shall be upon a hasty and precipitate view or upon a due and mature examination is in our power. Experience showing us that in most cases we are able to suspend the present dissatisfaction of any desire. But if any extreme disturbance, as sometimes it happens, possesses our whole mind, as when the pain of the rack and impetuous uneasiness, as of love, anger, or any other violent passion running away with us, allows us not the liberty of thought, and we are not masters enough of our own minds to consider thoroughly and examine fairly, God, who knows our frailty, pities our weakness, and requires of us no more than and then no more than we are able to do, and seize what was and what was not in our power, will judge as a kind and merciful Father. Government of our passions, the right improvement of liberty. So there's kind of Greek, the control of the passions, but the forbearance of a too hasty compliance with our desires, the moderation and restraint of our passions, so that our understanding may be free to examine and reason unbiased, give its judgment, being that whereon a right direction of our conduct to true happiness depends. 'Tis in this we should employ our chief care and endeavors. In this we should take pains to suit the relish of our minds to the true intrinsic good or ill that is in things, and not permit an allowed or supposed possible great and weighty good to slip out of our thoughts without leaving any relish or desire of itself there, till by a due consideration of its true worth we have formed appetites in our minds suitable to it, and made ourselves uneasy in the want of it, or in the fear of losing it. And how much this is in everyone's power, by making resolutions to himself, such as he may keep, is easy for everyone to try. Nor let anyone say he cannot govern his passions, nor hinder them from breaking out and carrying him into action. For what he can do before a prince or a great man, he can do alone, or in the presence of God if he will. So a very individualistic notion of morality devoid of context and sociality. How men come to pursue different courses. From what has been said, it is easy to give account how it comes to pass that though all men desire happiness, yet their wills carry them so contrarily, and consequently some of them to what is evil. And to this I say that the various and contrary choices that men make in the world do not argue that they do not all pursue good, but that the same thing is not good to every man alike. This variety of pursuit shows that everyone does not place his happiness in the same thing or choose the same way to it. Were all the concerns of men terminated in this life, why one followed study and knowledge, and another hawking and hunting, why one chose luxury and debauchery, another sobriety and riches, would not be because every one of these did not aim at his own happiness, but because their happiness was placed in different things. And therefore it was a right answer of the physician to his patient that had 4 eyes, if you have more pleasure in the taste of wine than in the use of your sight, wine is good for you. But if the pleasure of seeing be greater to you than that of drinking, wine is not. The mind has a different relish as well as the palate, and you will as fruitlessly, okay, and you will as fruitlessly endeavor to delight all men with riches or glory, which yet some men place their happiness in, as you would to satisfy all men's hunger with cheese or lobsters, which though very agreeable and delicious fare to some, are to others extremely nauseous and offensive. And many people would with reason prefer the griping of a hungry belly to those dishes which are a feast to others. Hence it was, I think, that the philosophers of old did in vain inquire whether summum bonum consisted in riches or bodily delights or virtue or contemplation, and they might have as reasonably disputed whether the best relish were to be found in apples, plums, or nuts, and have divided themselves into sects upon it. For as pleasant tastes depend not on the things themselves, but their agreeableness to this or that particular palate, wherein there is great variety, so the greatest happiness consists in the having those things which produce the greatest pleasure, and in the absence of those which cause the disturbance any pain. So this is kind of interesting, getting back to the concept of passive power versus active power. Locke is sort of saying there is no such thing as an active good. There is no such thing as like an objectively good meal. Some may subjectively find lobster to be good, others find it to be evil, but it is within the passive power of the man to enable these things to be good depending upon his taste. We could extrapolate this to say that some people enjoy murder and others enjoy healing. And so the good or evil of the thing would be dependent upon the desires of the man or the will of the man or whatever it is. The whole distinction between will and desire is still confusing to me, but let's keep reading. If therefore men in this life only have hope, if in this life they can only enjoy, 'tis not strange nor unreasonable that they would seek happiness by avoiding all things that disease them here and pursuing all that delight them, wherein it will be no wonder to find variety and difference. For if there be no prospect beyond the grave, and inference is certainly right, let us eat and drink, let us enjoy what we delight in, for tomorrow we shall die. YOLO, you only live once. This, I think, may serve to show us the reason why, though all men's desires tend to happiness, yet they are not moved by the same object. Men may choose different things, and yet all choose right, supposing them only like a company of poor insects, whereof some are bees delighted with flowers and their sweetness, others beetles delighted with other kinds of viands, which having enjoyed for a season, they should cease to be and exist no more forever. These things duly weighed will give us, I think, a clear view into the state of human liberty, how men come to choose ill. Liberty, 'tis plain, consists in a power to do or not to do or forbear doing, as we will. This cannot be denied. But this seeming to comprehend only the actions of a man consecutive to volition, it is further inquired whether we be at liberty to will or no. And this it hath been answered, that in most cases a man is not at liberty to forbear the act of volition. He must exert an act of his will, whereby the action proposed is made to exist or not exist. But yet there is a case wherein a man is at liberty in respect of willing, and that is the choosing of a remote God as an end to be pursued. Here a man may suspend the act of his choice from being determined for or against the thing proposed till he has examined whether it be really of a nature in itself and consequences to make him happy or no. For when he has once chosen it, and thereby it is become a part of his happiness, and it raises desire, and that proportionably gives him uneasiness, which determines his will, and sets him at work in pursuit of his choice on all occasions that offer. And here we may see how it comes to pass that a man may justly incur punishment, though it be certain that in all the particular actions that he wills, he does and necessarily does will that which he then judges to be good. For though his will be always determined by that which is judged good by his understanding, yet it excuses him not, because by a too hasty choice of his own making, he has imposed on himself wrong measures of good and evil, which, however false and fallacious, have the same influence on all his future conduct as if they were true and right. So Locke seems to be bridging the is-ought gap by suggesting that evil is a product of people not being sufficiently educated, and these measures of good and evil being false and fallacious, which if he had the correct and true measures of good and evil, then he would surely do what is right and good, which I have a problem with this definition of morality or view of human nature. He has vitiated his own palate and must be answerable to himself for the sickness and death that follows from it. The eternal law of nature of things must not be altered to comply with his ill-ordered choice. If the neglect or abuse of the liberty he had to examine what would really and truly make for his happiness misleads him, the miscarriages that follow on it must be imputed to his own election. He had a power to suspend his determination. It was given him that he might examine and take care of his own happiness and look that he were not deceived, and he could never judge that it was better to be deceived than not in a matter of so great and near concernment. What has been said may also discover to us the reason why men in this world prefer different things to pursue happiness by different courses. But yet, since men are always constant and in earnest in matters of happiness and misery, the question still remains how men come often to prefer the worse to the better and to choose that which by their own confession has made them miserable. To account for the various and contrary ways, Locke has said before he thinks it's ridiculous that the mind has several different parts or different faculties which are contradictory. He believes in the oneness of the consciousness. But that's how I would explain the contradiction of mankind, that our mind has different parts which war against one another. But he says, to account for the various and contrary ways men take, though all aim at being happy, we must consider whence the various uneasinesses that determine the will in the preference of each voluntary action have their rise. Some of them come from causes not in our power, such as are often the pains of the body from want, disease, or outward injuries, as the rack, etc., which then present and violent operate for the most part forcibly on the will, and turn the courses of men's lives from virtue, piety, and religion, and what before they judge to lead to happiness, everyone not endeavoring or through, diffuse? I don't know what that word is. Through decise, I have no clue what that is. Through something not being able, by the contemplation of remote and future good, to raise in himself desires of them strong enough to counterbalance the uneasiness he feels in those bodily torments, or to keep his will steady in the choice of those actions which lead to future happiness. A neighbor country has been of late a tragical theater from which we might fetch instances if there needed any, and the world did not in all countries and ages furnish examples enough to confirm that received observation. Necessitas cogit ad turpa, and therefore there is great reason for us to pray, lead us not into temptation, from wrong desires arising from wrong judgment. So this is the idea that morality springs out of abstraction, that we reach the good by first having good, educated, abstract judgments, and thereby we derive desires to do the good, as opposed to the idea of like we first have a desire to live, and therefore from that desire we develop the abstraction of judgment in order to achieve our desires. So it is the liberal ontology is fundamentally creationist, supposing first order, logos, and judgment, and then thumos and passion. Whereas, the evolutionary model suggests that first we have thumos and passion, and then over a long struggle, we develop abstract reasoning and so on. Other uneasinesses arise from our desires of absent good, which desires always bear proportion to and depend on the judgment we make and the relish we have of any absent good, in both which we are apt to be variously misled, and that by our own fault. In the first place, I shall consider the wrong judgments men make of future good and evil, whereby their desires are misled. Our judgment of present good or evil always be right. As to present happiness and misery, when that alone comes in consideration and the consequences are quite removed, a man never chooses amiss. He knows what best pleases him, and that he actually prefers. Things in their present enjoyment are what they seem. The apparent and real good are, in this case, always the same. For the pain or pleasure being just so great and no greater than it is felt, the present good or evil is so much as it really appears, and therefore, were every action of ours concluded within itself and drew no consequences after it, we should undoubtedly never err in our choice of good, and should always be infallibly prefer the best. Were the pains of honest industry and of starving with hunger and cold set together before us, nobody would be in doubt which to choose. Were the satisfaction of a lust and the joys of heaven offered at once to anyone's present possession, he would not balance or err in the determination of his choice. So it's interesting that he compares the joys of heaven to a lust. What exactly does that mean? Is that sacrilegious to compare the desire for heaven with a lust? But since our voluntary actions carry not all the happiness and misery that depend on them along with them in their present performance, but are the precedent causes of good and evil which they draw after them and bring upon us, when they themselves are past and cease to be, our desires look beyond our present enjoyments and carry the mind out to absent good according to the necessity which we think there is of it, to the making or increase of our happiness. 'Tis our opinion of such a necessity that gives it its attraction. Without that we are not moved by absent good, for in this narrow scantling of capacity, which we are accustomed to and sensible of here, wherein we enjoy but one pleasure at once, which, when all uneasiness is away, is, whilst it lasts, sufficient to make us think ourselves happy. 'Tis not all remote and even apparent good that affects us. Because the indolency and enjoyment we have is sufficient for our present happiness, we desire not to venture the change, since we judge that we are happy already, being content, and that is enough, for who is content is happy. But as soon as any new uneasiness comes, this happiness is disturbed, and we are set afresh on work in the pursuit of happiness, from a wrong judgment of what makes a necessary part of their happiness. Their aptness, therefore, to conclude that they may be happy without it is one great occasion that men often are not raised to the desire of the greatest absent good. For while such thoughts possess them, the joys of a future state move them not. They have little concern or uneasiness about them, and the will, free from the determination of such desires, is left to the pursuit of nearer satisfactions and to the removal of those uneasinesses which it then feels in its want of and longings after them. So kind of interesting idea that if a cookie is in front of you, you want it. If you have no concept of a cookie, you don't want a cookie. If you think something's a cookie but it's not actually not, then you want something that you think is good but is not truly good. So our ability to perceive the truth of a situation does have an impact, I suppose, in the long term of whether we've received the good or the bad. So there is an obvious truth there. Change but a man's view of these things. Let him see that virtue and religion are necessary to his happiness. Let him look into the future state of bliss or misery and see their God, the righteous judge, ready to render to every man according to his deeds. To them who by patient continuance in well-doing seek for glory and honor and immortality, eternal life. But unto every soul that doth evil, indignation and wrath, tribulation and anguish. To him I say, who hath a prospect of the different state of perfect happiness or misery that attends all men after this life, depending on their behavior here, the measures of good and evil that govern his choice are mightily changed. For since nothing of pleasure and pain in this life can bear any proportion to endless happiness or exquisite misery of an immortal soul hereafter, actions in his power will have their preference, not according to the transient pleasure or pain that accompanies or follows them here, but as they serve to secure that perfect durable happiness hereafter. But to account more particularly for the misery that men often bring on themselves, notwithstanding that they do in all in earnest pursue happiness, we must consider how things come to be represented to our desires under deceitful appearances, and that is by the judgment pronounced wrongly concerning them. To see how far this reaches and what are the causes of wrong judgment, we must remember that things are judged good or bad in a double sense. First, that which is properly good or bad is nothing but barely pleasure or pain. Secondly, but because not only present pleasure and pain, but that also which is apt by its efficacy or consequences to bring it upon us at a distance is a proper object of our desires and apt to move a creature that has foresight, that is foresight. Therefore, things also that draw after them pleasure and pain are configured as good and evil. The wrong judgment that misleads us and makes the will often fasten on the worst side lies in misreporting upon the various comparisons of these. So fake news. The wrong judgment I am here speaking of is not what one man may think of the determination of another, but what every man himself must confess to be wrong. For since I lay it for a certain ground that every intelligent being really seeks happiness, which consists in the enjoyment of pleasure without any considerable mixture of uneasiness, 'tis impossible anyone should willingly put into his own draught any bitter ingredient or leave out anything in his power that would tend to his satisfaction and the completing of his happiness, but only by wrong judgment. I shall not here speak of that mistake which is the name of wrong judgment, but of that wrong judgment which every man himself must confess to be so. Therefore, as to present pleasure and pain, the mind, as has been said, never mistakes that which is really good or evil, that which is the greater pleasure or the greater pain is really just as it appears. But though present pleasure and pain show their difference in degree so plainly as not to leave room for mistake, yet when we compare present pleasure or pain with future, which is usually the case in the most important determinations of the will, we often make wrong judgments of them, taking our measures of them in different positions of distance. So in comparing present and future, so it's basically, it's all about time preference, right? Time preference. That's basically all it is. And if men have different time preference, then they have different receptivity to moral argument. Objects near our view are apt to be thought greater than those of a larger size that are more remote. And so it is with pleasures and pains the present are apt to carry it, and those at a distance having the disadvantage in the comparison. Thus most men, like spendthrift heirs, are apt to judge a little in hand better than a great deal to come, and so for small matters in possession, part with great ones in reversion. But that this is a wrong judgment, everyone must allow. Let his pleasure consist in whatever it will, since that which is future will certainly come to be present, and then, having the same advantage of nearness, will show itself in its full dimensions and discover his willful mistakes who judged of it by unequal measures. Were the pleasure of drinking accompanied the very moment a man takes off his glass with that sick stomach and aching head, which in some men are sure to follow not many hours after, I think nobody, whatever pleasure he had in his cups, would on these occasions even let wine touch his lips, which yet he daily swallows, and the evil side comes to be chosen only by the fallacy of a little difference in time. But if pleasure or pain can be so lessened only by a few hours' removal, how much more it will be so by a farther distance to a man that will not by a right judgment do what time will, i.e. bring it home upon himself and consider it as present, and there take its true dimensions. This is the way we usually impose on ourselves in respect of bare pleasure and pain, or the true degrees of happiness and misery. The future loses its just proportion, and what is present obtains the preference as the greater. So this is a very interesting situation in which essentially Locke is saying that a man's capacity for morality is determined by his capacity to abstract into the future and consider future states equal or co-equal with present states. And so essentially a man's intelligence determines his morality. This is very interesting. And while there are certainly exceptions to this and problems with this, I actually think this is somewhat convincing and somewhat borne out by research. The future loses its just proportion, and what is present obtains the preference as the greater. I mentioned not here the wrong judgment, whereby the absent are not only lessened but reduced to perfect nothing. When men enjoy what they can in present and make sure of that, concluding amiss that no evil will thence follow, for that lies not in comparing the greatness of future good and evil, which is that we are here speaking of, but in another sort of wrong judgment, which is concerning good and evil, as it is considered to be the cause and procurement of pleasure and pain that will fall from it. The cause of our judging amiss when we compare our present pleasure or pain with future seems to me to be the weak and narrow constitution of our minds. We cannot well enjoy two pleasures at once, much less any pleasure almost whilst pain possesses us. The present pleasure, if it be not very languid and almost none at all, fills our narrow souls, and so takes up the whole mind that it scarce leaves any thought of things absent. Or if among our pleasures there are some which are not strong enough to exclude the consideration of things at a distance, yet we have so great an abhorrence of pain that a little of it extinguishes all our pleasures. A little bitter mingled in our cup leaves no relish of the sweet. Hence it comes that at any rate we desire to be rid of the present evil, which we are apt to think nothing absent can equal, because under the present pain we find not ourselves capable of any the least degree of happiness. Men's daily complaints are a loud proof of this. The pain that anyone actually feels is still of all other the worst. And it is with anguish they cry out, any rather than this, nothing can be so intolerable as what I now suffer. And therefore our whole endeavors and thoughts are in intent to get rid of the present evil before all things as the first necessary condition to our happiness, let what will follow. Nothing, as we passionately think, can exceed or almost equal the uneasiness that sits so heavy upon us. And because the absistence from a present pleasure that offers itself is a pain, nay, oftentimes a very great one, the desire being inflamed by a near and tempting object, 'tis no wonder that operates after the same manner that pain does, and lessens in our thoughts what is future, and so forces us as it were blindfold into its embraces. Add to this that absent good, or, which is the same thing, future pleasure, especially if of a sort which we are unacquainted with, seldom is able to counterbalance any uneasinesses, either of pain or desire, which is present. For its greatness being no more than what shall be really tasted when enjoyed, men are apt enough to lessen that to make it give place to any present desire, and conclude with themselves that when it comes to a trial, it may possibly answer the report or opinion that generally passes of it, they having often found that not only what others have magnified, but even what they themselves have enjoyed with great pleasure and delight at one time has proved insipid or nauseous at another, and therefore they see nothing in it for which they should forego a present enjoyment. But that this is a false way of judging when applied to the happiness of another life, they must confess, unless they will say God cannot make those happy he designs to be so. For that being intended for a state of happiness, it must certainly be agreeable to everyone's wish and desire. Could we suppose their relishes as different there as they are here, yet the manna in heaven will suit everyone's palate. Thus much of the wrong judgment we make of present and future pleasure and pain when they are compared together, and so the absent considered as future. As to things good or bad in their consequences, and by the aptness is in them to procure us good or evil in the future, we judge amiss several ways. When we judge that so much evil does not really depend on them, as in truth there does, when we judge that though the consequence be of that moment, yet it is not of that certainty, but that it may otherwise fall out, or else by some means to be avoided, as by industry, address, change, repentance, etc. That these are wrong ways of judging were easy to show in every particular, if I would examine that at large singly, but I shall only mention this in general vis-a-vis that it is a very wrong and irrational way of proceeding to venture a greater good for a less upon certain guesses, and before a due examination be made proportionable to the weightiness of the matter and the concernment it is to us not to mistake. This, I think, everyone must confess, especially if he considers the usual causes of this wrong judgment, whereof these following are some. Ignorance. He that judges without informing himself to the utmost that he is capable cannot acquit himself of judging amiss. Inadvertency. When a man overlooks even that which he does know, this is an affected and present ignorance which misleads our judgments as much as the other. Judging is, as it were, balancing an account and determining on which side the odds lies. If therefore either side be huddled up in haste, and several of the sums that should have gone into the reckoning be overlooked and left out, this precipitancy causes as wrong a judgment as if it were a perfect ignorance. That which most commonly causes this is the prevalency of some present pleasure or pain heightened by our feeble, passionate nature, most strongly wrought upon by what is present. To check this precipitancy, our understanding and reason was given us, if we will make a right use of it, to search and see, and then judge thereupon. Without liberty, the understanding would be to no purpose, and without understanding, liberty, if it could be, would signify nothing. If a man sees what would do him good or harm, what would make him happy or miserable, without being able to move himself one stop towards or from it, what is he the better for seeing? And he that is at liberty to ramble in perfect darkness, what is his liberty better than if he were drawn up and down as a bubble by the force of the wind? The being acted by a blind impulse from without or from within is little odds. The first, therefore, and great use of liberty is to hinder blind precipitancy. The principal exercise of freedom is to stand still, open the eyes, look about, and take a view of the consequence of what we are going to do as much as the weight of the matter requires. How much sloth and negligence, heat and passion, the prevalency of fashion, or acquired indispositions do severally contribute on occasion to these wrong judgments, I shall not here further inquire. I shall only add one other false judgment, which I think necessary to mention because perhaps it is little taken notice of, though of great influence. All men desire happiness. That's past doubt. But, as has been already observed, when they are rid of pain, they are apt to take up with any pleasure at hand, or that custom has endeared to them, or rest satisfied in that, and so being happy till some new desire, by making them uneasy, disturbs that happiness, and shows them that they are not so, they look no farther, nor 'tis the will determined to any action in pursuit of any other known or apparent good. Wrong judgment of what is necessary to our happiness. For since we find that we cannot enjoy all sorts of good, but one excludes another, we do not fix our desires on every apparent greater good unless it be judged to be necessary to our happiness. If we think we can be happy without it, it moves us not. This is another occasion to men of judging wrong, when they take not that to be necessary to their happiness, which really is so. This mistake misleads us both in the choice of the good we aim at, and very often in the means to it, when it is a remote good. But which way ever it be, either by placing it where really it is not, or by neglecting the means as not necessary to it, when a man misses his great end, happiness, he will acknowledge he judged not right. That which contributes to this mistake is the real supposed unpleasantness of the actions which are the way to this end, it seeming so preposterous a thing to men to make themselves unhappy in order to happiness that they do not easily bring themselves to it. We can change the agreeableness or disagreeableness in things. The last enquiry, therefore, concerning this matter is whether it be in a man's power to change the pleasantness or unpleasantness that accompanies any sort of action. And to that it is plain in many cases he can. Men may and should correct their palates and give a relish to what either has or they suppose has none. The relish of the mind is as various as that of the body, and like that too may be altered, and 'tis a mistake to think that men cannot change the displeasingness of indifferency that is in actions into pleasure and desire, if they will do but what is in their power. A due consideration will do in some cases, and practice, application, and custom in most. Bread or tobacco may be neglected where they are shown to be useful to health because of an indifferency or disrelish to them. He's promoting tobacco use. Reason, consideration at first recommends and begins their trial, and use finds or custom makes them pleasant. Wow, so the high carb, high tobacco diet is what Locke recommends. That this is so in virtue too is very certain. Actions are pleasing or displeasing either in themselves or considered as a means to a greater, more desirable end. The eating of a well-seasoned dish suited to a man's palate may move the mind by the delight itself that accompanies the eating without reference to any other end, to which the consideration of the pleasure there is in health and strength, to which that meat is subservient, may add a new gusto, able to make us swallow up an ill-relished potion. In the latter of these, any action is rendered more or less pleasing only by the contemplation of the end and the being more or less persuaded of its tendency to it or necessary connection with it. But the pleasure of the action itself is best acquired or increased by use and practice. Trials often reconcile us to that which at a distance we looked on with aversion, and by repetitions wears us into a liking of what possibly in the first essay displeased us. Habits have powerful charms and put so strong attractions of easiness and pleasure into what we accustom ourselves to that we cannot forbear to do, or at least be easy in the omission of actions which habitual practice has suited and thereby recommends to us. Though this be very visible and everyone's experience shows him he can do, yet it is a part in the conduct of men towards their happiness neglected to a degree that it will be possibly entertained as a paradox if it be said that men can make things or actions more or less pleasing to themselves, and thereby remedy that to which one may justly impute a great deal of their wandering. Fashion and the common opinion having settled wrong notions, and education and custom ill habits, and the just values of things are misplaced, and the palates of men corrupted. Pains should be taken to rectify these, and contrary habits change our pleasures and give a relish to that which is necessary or conducive to our happiness. This everyone must confess he can do, and when happiness is lost, the misery overtake him, he will confess he did amiss in neglecting it and condemn himself for it. And I ask everyone whether he has not often done so. So kind of interesting, the concept of habits and the ability to make things displeasing into pleasing, things which are pleasing into displeasing. And you look at Orthodox Judaism, the many commandments and mitzvahs that they have there of, to not cut the hair on the corners of the head, to wear a skull cap, to pray in such a way, to learn Hebrew, to do all of these things which are in themselves not very pleasing. But through habituation, Locke supposes that these things may be made pleasing. And so the pressure in Judaism and the good Jewish man is he who can best change those things which are not naturally pleasing to the animal sense, to change those things into things which are pleasing, and so accomplish those mitzvot, those commandments, and to become righteous in the Jewish community. This is not so much necessarily the exercise of self-control, although in some cases it is if he doesn't really change the desire implicit within the act. But really it's about being able to take something which is perhaps boring and make it into something that is enjoyable. This is not restricted to Judaism. Of course, we see it in all major religions, Christianity, Hinduism, Islam. And here we might say that by reading Locke, we make something which is boring into something pleasurable, and so heighten our powers of habituation, preference of vice to virtue, a manifest wrong judgment. I shall not enlarge any farther on the wrong judgments and neglect of what is in their power, whereby men mislead themselves. This would make a volume and is not my business, but whatever false notions or shameful neglect of what is in their power may put men out of their way to happiness and distract them, as we see in so different courses of life. This is yet certain, that morality established upon its true foundations cannot but determine the choice in anyone that will but consider. And he that will not be so far a rational creature as to reflect seriously upon infinite happiness and misery must needs condemn himself as not making that use of his understanding he should. The rewards and punishments of another life which the Almighty has established, as the enforcements of its laws, are of weight enough to determine the choice against whatever pleasure or pain this life can show, when the eternal state is considered but in its bare possibility, which nobody can make any doubt of. He that will allow exquisite and endless happiness to be but the possible consequence of a good life here, and the contrary state the possible reward of a bad one, must own himself to judge very much amiss, if he does not conclude that a virtuous life, with the certain expectation of everlasting bliss, which may come, is to be preferred to a vicious one, with the fear of that dreadful state of misery, which 'tis very possible may overtake the guilty, or at the best the terrible uncertain hope of annihilation. This is evidently so, though the virtuous life here had nothing but pain, and the vicious continual pleasure, which yet is, for the most part, quite otherwise, and wicked men have not so much odds to brag of, even in their present possession. Nay, all things rightly considered here have, I think, even the worst part here. But when infinite happiness is put in one scale against infinite misery in the other, if the worst that comes to the pious man, if he mistakes, be the best that the wicked can attain to, if he be in the right, who can without madness run the venture? Who in his wits would choose to come within a possibility of infinite misery, which, if he miss, there is yet nothing to be got by the hazard? So this is like Pascal's wager. Whereas on the other side, the sober man ventures nothing against infinite happiness to be got if his expectation comes not to pass. If the good man be in the right, he is eternally happy. If he mistakes, he is not miserable, he feels nothing. On the other side, if the wicked be in the right, he is not happy. If he mistakes, he is infinitely miserable. Must it? So let's kind of relook at that. If he's right, he's happy. If he mistakes, he is not miserable and feels nothing. If the wicked is right, he is not happy. If he mistakes, he is infinitely miserable. So I guess I'm not sure why that is the case. I guess he's saying if you live a life of pain of the priest, if you defer gratification for this life and then you die and you don't go to heaven, well, it's like whatever, YOLO, what did it even matter? Who cares? But if it's possible that heaven and hell exist, then you did the right thing and you went to heaven forever. On the other hand, for the evil person, if he does evil in this life and feels good about it, and there's no heaven or hell, well, then he had a good life, so what, YOLO, it doesn't matter, nihilism, whatever. But on the other hand, if heaven and hell do exist, then he felt good in this life and then went to hell forever. So it's kind of saying that, well, if heaven or hell doesn't exist, nothing really matters either way, so you might as well be the priest who lives a miserable life and then dies, but perhaps possibly goes to heaven, versus the wicked man who might possibly have a good life with women and riches and all sorts of tasty food, but ultimately he's either going to hell or nothing happens either way. So in the nihilistic case, in the materialist case, that nothing really matters, you really have nothing to lose by living a miserable life. You have nothing to gain by a pleasurable life, because in either case, the gain or loss thereof is but a mere lifetime, which comes and ends in the blink of an eye. Whereas if there is even a chance of heaven or hell, then by acting as a good man, you sort of make a wager towards the greatest lottery of eternal life. Whereas if you deny that possibility, you risk eternal hell. So it is Pascal's wager. It is a kind of a nihilism about the moment. saying that only eternal things will suffice to the rational man, to the abstract man, to the judging man. Must it not be a most manifest wrong judgment that does not presently see to which side in this case the preference is to be given? I have forborne to mention anything of the certainty or probability of a future state, designing here to show the wrong judgment that anyone must allow he makes upon his own principles, laid how he pleases, who prefers the short pleasures of a vicious life upon any consideration, whilst he knows and cannot be certain that a future life is at least possible. Recapitulation. To conclude this inquiry into human liberty, which, as it stood before, I myself from the beginning fearing, and a very judicious friend of mine since the publication suspecting to have some mistake in it, though he could not particularly show it to me, I was put upon a stricter review of this chapter, wherein, lighting upon a very easy and scarce observable slip I had made, and putting one seemingly indifferent word for another, that discovery opened to me this present view, which here in the second edition I submit to the learned world, and which in short is this: liberty is a power to act or not to act according as the mind directs. I'm gonna sneeze. A power to direct the operative faculties to motion, arrest in particular instances is that which we call the will. So the liberty is the power to act or not to act. That's very simple. And then the will is the power to direct the operative faculties to motion, arrest in particular instances. So I don't understand the difference between the power to act or not to act and then the power to direct operative faculties to motion, arrest. It seems like a restating. It seems like you're taking the same definition and you're just making it fancier. So maybe someone could explain to me the distinction there. That which in the train of our voluntary actions determines the will to any change of operations is some present uneasiness, which is, or at least is always accompanied with that of desire. So the train of voluntary actions determines the will. So desire determines the train of our voluntary actions. The will is determined by desire in a train of voluntary. The wording here is so obscure. That which in the train, we're in a train of our voluntary actions, determines the will to any change of operations is some present uneasiness. So the moment we decide to change our train of voluntary actions, that the impulse to do so is our desire. The desire informs the will. The will directs the operative faculties to motion or rest in particular instances. And the liberty is a power to act or not to act. Okay. How is it not all just collapsible to desire? Desire is always moved by evil to fly it, because a total freedom from pain always makes a necessary part of our happiness, but every good, nay, every greater good, does not constantly move desire, because it may not make or may not be taken to make any necessary part of our happiness. For all that we desire is only to be happy. Though this general desire of happiness operates constantly and invariably, yet the satisfaction of any particular desire can be suspended from determining the will to any subservient action till we have maturely examined whether the particular apparent good which we then desire makes a part of our real happiness or be consistent or inconsistent with it. The result of our judgment upon that examination is what ultimately determines the man who could not be free if his will were determined by anything but his own desire guided by his own judgment. I know that liberty by some is placed in an indifferency of the man antecedent to the determination of his will. I wish they who lay so much stress on such an antecedent indifferency, as they call it, had told us plainly whether this supposed indifferency be antecedent to the thought and judgment of the understanding, as well as to the degree of the will, for it is pretty hard to state it between them, i.e., immediately after the judgment of the understanding and before the determination of the will, because the determination of the will immediately follows the judgment of the understanding, and to place liberty in an indifferency antecedent to the thought and judgment of the understanding seems to me to place liberty in a state of darkness, wherein we can neither see nor say anything of it. At least it places in a subject incapable of no agent. Excuse me. Oh boy. At least it places in it a subject incapable of it, no agent being allowed capable of liberty, but in consequence of thought and judgment. I am not nice about phrases, and therefore consent to say with those that love to speak so, that liberty is placed in indifferency, but 'tis in an indifferency that remains after the judgment of the understanding, yea, even after the determination of the will, and that is an indifferency not of the man. For after he has once judged which is best vis-a-vis to do or forbear, he is no longer indifferent, but an indifferency of the operative powers of the man, which remaining equally able to operate or to forbear operating, after as before the degree of the will are in a state which, if anyone pleases, may be called indifferency. And as far as this indifferency reaches, a man is free and no farther, v.g. I have the ability to move my hand or to let it rest. That operative power is indifferent to move or not to move my hand. I am then in that respect perfectly free. My will determines that operative power to rest. I am yet free, because the indifferency of that my operative power to act or not to act still remains. The power of moving my hand is not at all impaired by the determination of my will, which at present orders rest. With the hiccups. The indifferency of that power to act or not to act is just as it was before, and will appear if the will puts it to the trial by ordering the contrary. But if during the rest of my hand it be seized with a sudden palsy, the indifferency of that operative power is gone, and with it my liberty. I have no longer freedom in that respect, but am under a necessity of letting my hand rest. On the other side, if my hand be put in motion by a convulsion, the indifferency of that operative faculty is taken away by that motion, and my liberty is in that case lost, for I am under a necessity of having my hand move. I have added this to show in what sort of indifferency liberty seems to make me consist, and not in any other real or imaginary. True notions concerning the nature and extent of liberty are of so great importance that I hope I shall be pardoned this digression, which my attempt to explain it has led me into. The ideas of will, volitions, liberty, and necessity in this chapter of power came naturally in my way. In a former edition of this treatise, I gave an account of my thoughts concerning them according to the light I then had, and now, as a lover of truth and not a worshipper of my own doctrines, I own some change of my opinion, which I think I have discovered ground for. In what I first writ, I with an unbiased indifferency followed truth, whither I thought she led me. But neither being so vain as to fancy, he's simping for truth. He's simping for truth, a woman. But neither being so vain as to fancy infallibility, nor so disingenuous as to dissemble. I don't know what that means. To dissemble my mistakes for fear of blemishing my reputation, I have, with the same sincere delight for truth, only not been ashamed to publish what a severer enquiry has suggested. It is not impossible, but that some may think my former notions right, and some, as I have already found, these latter, and some neither. I shall not at all wonder at this variety of men's opinions and partial deductions of reason in controverted points, being so very rare, and exact ones in abstract notions not so very easy, especially if of any length. And therefore I would think myself not a little beholden to anyone who would upon these or any other grounds fairly clear the subject of liberty from any difficulties that may yet remain. But before I close this chapter, it may perhaps be to our purpose to help us give us a clearer conceptions about power if we make our thoughts take a little more exact survey of action. I have said above that we have ideas but of two sorts of action, vis-a-vis motion and thinking. These in truth, though called and counted actions, yet if nearly considered, will not be found to be always perfectly so. For if I mistake not, there are instances of both kinds, which upon consideration will be found rather passions than actions, and consequently so far the effects barely of passive powers in those subjects, which yet on their account are thought agents. For in these instances the subject that hath motion or thought receives the impression whereby it is put into that action purely from without, and so acts merely by the capacity it has to receive such an impression from some external agent, and such a power is not properly an active power, but a mere passive capacity in the subject. Sometimes the substance or agent puts itself into action by its own power, and this is properly active power. Whatsoever modification a substance has whereby it produces any effect, that is called action, v.g. a solid subject by motion operates on or alters the sensible ideas of another substance, and therefore the modification of motion we call action. But yet this motion in that solid substance is, when rightly considered, but a passion, if it received it only from some external agent. So that the active power of motion is in no substance which cannot begin motion in itself or in another substance when at rest. So likewise in thinking, a power to receive ideas or thoughts from the operation of any external substance is called a power of thinking, but this is but a passive power or capacity. So you receive the idea and then you judge upon it, like the Greeks received ideas from the muses and then made them into words and poetry. A passive power capacity. And the empiricist is a passive person receiving the idea, receiving morality, not creating his own morality, not an active Nietzschean, but to be able to bring into view ideas out of sight at one's own choice and to compare which of them one thinks fit. This is an active power. So the active power is of discerning which ideas you like one over the other. Truth being a woman, the company of women being desired by Locke. Locke being a feminist. This reflection may be of some use to preserve us from mistakes about powers and actions, which grammar and the common frame of language may be apt to lead us into, since what is signified by verbs that grammarians call active does not always signify action, v.g. this proposition, I see the moon or a star, or I feel the heat of the sun, though expressed by a verb active, does not signify any action in me whereby I operate on those substances, but the reception of the ideas of light, roundness, and heat, wherein I am not active but barely passive and cannot, in that possession of my eyes or body, avoid receiving them. So that's not true. You can close your eyes and your body is acting when it creates sensory perception. It is an action of the mind upon the mind. So there are several objects within the mind that act upon each other in response to some impulse from the environment. But I don't think it's completely passive. I think there's an active element to it, which Locke does not perceive. But when I turn my eyes another way to remove my body out of the sunbeams, I am properly active because of my own choice. By a power within myself, I put myself into that motion. Such an action is the product of active power. So Locke seems to reject a kind of solipsistic view that you can create your own reality. You just have to accept the reality around you. And thus I have in a short draught given a view of our original ideas, from whence all the rest are derived, and of which they are made up, which, if I would consider as a philosopher and examine on what causes they depend, and of what they are made, I believe they might be reduced to these a very few primary and original ones, vis-a-vis extension, solidity, mobility, or the power of being moved, by which our senses we receive from the body, perceptivity, or the power of perception or thinking, motivity, or the power of moving, which by reflection we receive from our minds. I crave leave to make use of these two words to avoid the danger of being mistaken in the use of those which are equivocal, to which if we add existence, duration, number, which belong both to the one and the other, we have perhaps all the original ideas on which the rest depend. For these, I imagine, it might be explained the nature of colors, sounds, tastes, smells, and all other ideas we have, if we had but faculties acute enough to perceive the several modified extensions and motions of those minute bodies which produce those several sensations in us. But my present purpose being only to inquire into the knowledge of the mind has of the things by these ideas and appearances which God has fitted it to receive from them, and how the mind comes by that knowledge, rather than into their causes or manner of production, I shall not, contrary to the design of this essay, set myself to inquire philosophically into the particular constitution of bodies and the configuration of parts whereby they have the power to produce in us the ideas of their sensible qualities. I shall not enter into any further into that disquisition, it sufficing to my purpose to observe that gold or saffron has a power to produce in us the idea of yellow, and snow or milk, the idea of white, which we can only have by our sight without examining the texture of the parts of those bodies or the particular figures or motion of the particles which were bound from them to cause in us that particular sensation. Though when we go beyond the bare ideas of our minds and would inquire into their causes, we cannot conceive anything else it to be in the sensible object whereby it produces different ideas in us, but the different bulk, figure, number, texture, motion of its insensible parts. So here he says, gold or saffron has a power to produce in us the idea of yellow, snow or milk the idea of white. Well, if you're colorblind or blind in general, or your eyes have been mutated or robot eyes, then maybe you would not see yellow from gold or saffron. Maybe you would not see white from snow or milk. So there seems to be some active component to perception that Locke does not understand, because he doesn't understand the concept of like subconscious activity or unconscious activity. He only understands conscious, logical, abstract activity, and therefore he ignores most of human psychology and comes to possible mistakes because he didn't have the empirical faculty to observe those things which are subconscious. So we got to chapter 22 of mixed modes. Let's take a look at the chat, see how everybody's doing. We got 6 viewers and 15 likes. Kind of weird how everything's frozen for me. I don't know why that is. Anyway, YouTube is not receiving enough video to maintain smooth. They will experience buffering. Well, that's too bad. Why is that the case? Is my internet working? Wi-Fi looking for networks. Wi-Fi on. Wi-Fi looking for networks. Oh, come on. This is quite ridiculous, sir. Why? I don't want to turn the internet on and off. Why does it do this? If I stop the internet, is the stream just going to collapse? Let's see. As now it says excellent connection. I just don't understand. Oh well. Hired bots. I have not hired bots. Plastic juice, BPA. Fire rises. The mic magnifies the P sound. Palletized. Locke rambles. Fish letters. Grippin. Freud. January. Like I said, the current plan is to probably go to Hume. But, or maybe more Locke. There's actually a YOLO county in California. Surely he will mention virtue at least once. Surely. Outdated empiricists be like the mind is a space filled with objects, ideas. Arvel eternally BTFO'd. How is he going to recover from this? I don't think he is necessarily eternally BTFO'd. I don't know that I'm really BTFOing Locke by reading him and giving voicing occasional disagreements. I wouldn't describe that as a BTFO. But certainly as I'm reading this, certain contradictions come to my mind. This is very upsetting that I'm just going to turn the Wi-Fi off now. I mean, yeah. You're offline. Try again. I don't know why the internet is so bad. I guess we'll have to end this stream. Come to Cafe Milano. This is bigoted against chaotic evil. One of Abigail Shapiro's 22 New Year's resolutions was to drink more water. Thank you, Abby. What's your end game? More water, more milk. W. Locke's ruminations. Pleasure, pain, sloth, past, present, and future. Our deferred gratifications are really profound. Wow. Liberalism, bread and tobacco versus post-liberalism, keto and vape. I mean, if that's true, I'm not. I guess I am a pre-liberal. Well, I eat bread, but No tobacco for me. There's the NRX, much to think about. Can you institutionalize the promulgation of deferral of gratification, liberalism? Deferral of gratification is only a part of judgment, which is the real subject here. God provides the normative orientation needed for sound judgment. The existence of otherworldly damnation seems sufficiently improbable to a midwit empiricist. Now we're receiving no data. That's very encouraging. I'm glad that I pay money for this. Well, I'm just going to continue reading this even though the stream is over. Empiricism is half-wittedness. Locke is among the best of them, but it's still a silly position, and normie midwits and half-wits can't handle it all. Leads them to the stupidest situations. I mean, half-wittedness because they're only using half their wits. I suppose the point is that empiricism is pragmatically useful, but one not needs it as a wholesale worldview. Centrists win again. We must reclaim the center. Currently, it's being colonized by half-wits who call themselves centrists and liberals, frantically putting out one graph after another. Maybe I don't like the political connotations. The word centrist. Politics is dirty. True philosophy is pure. I think philosophy should determine politics, not politics philosophy. When you stare into the abyss, there lies Quillette. Am I the only one having problems? Yeah, everybody's having problems. I don't know how to solve it. I apologize. This is the first time I've had this problem. But apparently my internet is just not good and life sucks. You know, I thought he was freezing, and then I thought he might have just been taking a crazy pause. It's working, but every 2 minutes there's a 5-second pause. Liked. Complete silence ASMR. Okay, well, that's going to end it because I'm beyond frustrated. We got to page 281 on the road to 300. And I don't know if people can hear me, but I'm just going to say bye in the chat. So let me put this to the side for a moment. Sorry for the technical difficulties. I cannot resolve. Stream is end. Considering watching the new book club, yeah.